The night was unusually quiet in the city, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost unnatural. The streets shimmered faintly under the dim streetlights, reflecting off the wet pavement from a light drizzle earlier that evening. Sundar Pichai sat alone in the back seat of a modest black car, staring out of the window with a thoughtful expression. He wasn't surrounded by the flashing cameras or bodyguards that people often imagined. Instead, he traveled with only a trusted driver, keeping a low profile as he often liked to do when the weight of responsibility pressed down on him too hard. He had just finished a long day of meetings, his mind cluttered with discussions about innovation, ethics in technology, and decisions that could impact billions of lives. Yet beneath all the noise of business, there was something else resting on his heart, something heavier than strategy or numbers. Tucked carefully inside a small black leather bag beside him was an item that he never let out of his sight. It wasn't money. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't even something most people would consider valuable. But to Sundar it was priceless. As the car slowed down near a checkpoint on the highway, the soft red glow of police lights flashed ahead. The driver looked back through the rearview mirror, uncertain. "Sir, it seems like there's a stop tonight. Should we turn around?" the driver asked quietly. Sundar shook his head. "No, keep going, we have nothing to hide." His voice was calm, steady, though somewhere deep inside, a faint unease stirred. The police officers waved the car to the side. One of them, tall and broad, approached the driver's window with a flashlight. The beam cut through the interior of the car, briefly landing on Sundar's face before moving to the bag lying beside him. "License and registration," the officer demanded. The driver handed over the documents, his hands slightly trembling. The second officer, younger and more impatient, peered through the window and frowned. "What's in the bag?" he asked firmly, his hand already resting on the side of his belt. Sundar leaned forward slightly, his calm eyes meeting the officer's. "Just some personal belongings," he said softly. But the tone of the officer shifted immediately. "Step out of the car," the officer ordered. The driver's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. "Sir," he whispered, but Sundar raised his hand gently, signaling him to stay calm. Sundar opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air, his shoes clicking against the wet road. He wasn't afraid, but there was an unmistakable tension that seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. "Open the bag," the officer said, pointing to it. Sundar hesitated for just a moment. It wasn't because he feared what was inside, he already knew, but he understood the misunderstanding that could follow. Still, he reached down, picked up the bag, and slowly unzipped it. The officers leaned closer, their flashlights illuminating the contents. The younger officer's eyes widened in shock. His mouth opened slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The older officer took a step back, confusion crossing his face. "Sir, what is this?" he asked in a voice that was no longer commanding but shaken. Sundar looked down at the contents of the bag, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and unspoken memories. Inside wasn't gold, wasn't cash, wasn't anything illegal. But what it was held a story so deep and so haunting that it could shake anyone who dared to ask further. And just as the silence stretched painfully between them, a third police car arrived at the checkpoint, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A senior officer stepped out, his sharp eyes locking directly on Sundar. Within moments, whispers spread among the officers. One of them muttered under his breath, "Do you know who this is?" But the senior officer raised his hand, silencing everyone. He walked closer, looked into the bag, then back at Sundar, and said in a low, grave tone, "We need to take you in. Now." The driver gasped, frozen in disbelief. Sundar's calm expression didn't waver, but his heart began to beat harder. He knew this night was about to change everything. As the officers moved to escort him toward the police vehicle, Sundar turned his head slightly, looking back at the bag one last time. The rain began to fall again, each drop echoing like a drumbeat of fate. Nobody could understand why the world's most powerful CEO was being led away in handcuffs. And more importantly, nobody yet knew the truth about what was inside that bag. truth. That had the power to bring both sorrow and light, destruction and redemption. But Sundar knew, and that truth was about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The night closed in around him. The police car door slammed shut, and Sundar whispered to himself, "This was never about me. This is about something far greater." And in that moment, the story truly began. The ride to the police station felt endless, even though it was no more than 30 minutes. The hum of the engine was drowned by the pounding of rain on the car roof. Inside, the air was thick with silence. Sundar sat quietly in the back seat, his wrists bound by cold handcuffs that pressed into his skin. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't demanding special treatment. He simply stared out of the window as the blurred lights of the city passed by, his mind lost in places far away from that moment. The two officers in the front didn't know what to say. One kept glancing at him through the rear-view mirror as if wrestling with the thought of who was sitting in the back. They knew his face. They knew his name. But the sight of the bag's contents had changed everything. It wasn't something they could ignore, nor was it something they could easily explain. The younger officer finally broke the silence. "Sir, are we really doing the right thing here?" His voice trembled slightly. "I mean, this is Sundar Pichai. Why would he—" "Quiet," the senior officer cut him off sharply. "Our job isn't to question, it's to bring him in." Yet even his voice carried doubt, as if he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath. Memories began to surface, painful memories tied to the very thing in that bag. He remembered his childhood home in India, the narrow streets filled with dust and laughter, the way his mother's hands were always rough from work yet soft when she touched his face. He remembered the lessons his father taught him, about honesty, about humility, about carrying burdens even when no one else understood. Those lessons had guided him through life, and now they weighed on him heavier than ever. When the car pulled into the station, the officers guided him inside. Whispers followed instantly. Every head turned. The officers at the desk froze, unable to process what they were seeing. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "Is that really him? What on earth did he do?" Sundar was led into an interrogation room. It was small, cold, with white walls that seemed to close in on him. A single chair and table sat in the center. The bag was placed on the table, still unzipped, but the officers made sure not to touch it further. They looked at it as though it carried something dangerous, something untouchable. After a few tense minutes, the senior officer entered, followed by a man in plain clothes. The man wasn't a policeman. His calm confidence revealed he was someone higher, someone with influence. His sharp eyes studied Sundar carefully before he sat across from him. "Mr. Pichai," the man began, his tone both respectful and suspicious. "Do you understand why you're here?" Sundar met his gaze, his calmness unshaken. "I believe it has to do with what was found in the bag," he replied softly. The man leaned forward. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain it, because from where we stand, this doesn't make sense. Not for someone like you, not for someone with your power." Sundar's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "Power is not what you think it is," he said. "Sometimes the greatest power is carrying something the world cannot yet understand." The man frowned, tapping his fingers on the table. "What exactly are you carrying?" he asked. Sundar looked at the bag for a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying both pain and weight. "What's inside is a piece of my past, a piece of a story that should never have been buried. I carry it because I promised someone I would, and promises, they don't fade with time." The man's eyes narrowed. "Who did you promise?" Sundar lowered his gaze, his thoughts pulling him back into years he had tried to keep private. He remembered being a boy, sitting in the small living room of his house, listening to his grandmother's stories about resilience, about how even the poorest could have dignity if they held on to truth. He remembered a moment long ago when a tragedy had struck his neighborhood, something that left a scar on his family forever. Inside that bag was not just an object, It was the only evidence of that tragedy, something that connected his past to the choices he made as a leader today. Before Sundar could answer, the door to the room opened suddenly. Another officer walked in holding a file. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he set the file down in front of the plainclothes man. "Sir, you need to see this." The man opened the file, flipping through the pages. His eyes moved, quickly, his expression darkening with each line he read. Finally, he closed the file and looked at Sundar with something different now. "Fear. Mr. Pichai," he said slowly. "Why was this never reported? Why would you carry something like this alone?" Sundar leaned back in his chair, the weight of years pressing down on him. "Because sometimes," he whispered, "the truth is too dangerous to be told, and yet without truth, there is no healing." The room went silent. The younger officer shifted uneasily. The bag sat on the table, the faint outline of its contents visible under the dim light. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't money. But it was something that had the power to shake institutions, if revealed. Then, almost suddenly, the senior officer spoke again. "We can't keep this here, not in this room, not in this station. It's bigger than us." The man in plain clothes nodded, then turned to Sundar. "You're not under arrest, not yet. But until we understand this fully, you're not free to leave either. The world doesn't know about this, and if it does, everything changes." Sundar closed his eyes once more, knowing exactly what he meant. He had carried the burden for years, waiting for the right time to release it. He knew that moment was coming closer. But what he didn't know was that outside, in the rain-soaked darkness, someone else was watching. A figure stood near the station gates, their face hidden, their eyes fixed on the window of the room where Sundar sat. The figure made a quiet call on a phone, their voice sharp and urgent. "He has it. It's here. We can't let this go public." And, as the phone call ended, the storm outside grew heavier, lightning splitting the sky. Inside the station, Sundar felt a shiver down his spine. He didn't know that forces much larger than the police were about to step into this story. And what would happen next would not only test his resilience, it would test the strength of everything he believed in. The storm outside showed no signs of calming. Thunder rolled across the city like a warning, shaking the thin walls of the police station. Sundar sat quietly in the interrogation room, his hands still cuffed. Though the officers had grown less certain about keeping him restrained, the bag remained on the table untouched, yet it seemed to fill the entire room with a silent weight. The senior officer paced back and forth, his boots echoing against the tile floor, while the plainclothes investigator sat stiffly, his eyes locked on Sundar as if searching for cracks in his calmness. Sundar, however, showed no cracks. His face carried a strange mixture of peace and sorrow, like a man who had already walked through fire and carried the ashes with dignity. His silence unsettled them more than words ever could. Finally, the plainclothes man broke the silence. "Mr. Pichai, we read the file, but reading it and seeing it, they're different things. We need you to tell us what exactly happened. And why would you, of all people, be the one to hold on to this?" Sundar's eyes drifted toward the bag. He hesitated. It wasn't fear of them, or fear of consequences. It was fear of reopening wounds that had never fully healed. He thought of his mother again, her frail figure standing in the doorway of their old home, whispering words he could never forget. "Never let them bury the truth, Sundar. Promise me." His voice finally broke the silence, low and steady. "When I was young, there was an incident. Something terrible. It wasn't reported the way it should have been. People suffered, people were silenced. My family, we were caught in the middle. What's in that bag is the only piece left that proves what really happened. I kept it because the world wasn't ready to face it. Not then, maybe not even now." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The younger one whispered, "But if this is real, then entire systems, entire names could be destroyed." Sundar nodded slowly. "And maybe that's why it has to come out. Because the truth that is buried too long, it poisons everything." The storm rattled the windows as if nature itself agreed. Before the conversation could continue, the door burst open. Another officer rushed in, his face pale. "Sir, we have a situation outside. Men in black vehicles. They're not ours. They're demanding we hand him over." The room froze. The senior officer stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. "What do you mean, demanding?" "They know he's here," the officer stammered. "They said if we don't release him immediately, things will get ugly." The plainclothes man stood up sharply. "Who are they?" The officer shook his head. "They didn't identify themselves, but they don't look like regular people. They look trained." A chill swept through the room. Sundar remained, seated, his expression unchanged, though his heart began to race. He had expected resistance eventually, but not so soon. Not here. Whoever those men were, they weren't ordinary criminals. They were people who had been watching him for a long time, waiting for the moment he slipped, waiting for the bag to surface. The senior officer turned to Sundar, his voice urgent now. "Mr. Pichai, what is really going on here? Who else knows about this?" Sundar lowered his head. "More people than you think," he said quietly, "and some of them will stop at nothing to erase the past. You are caught in the middle of something larger than this station, larger than this city." The words unsettled everyone. The bag on the table suddenly felt like a ticking bomb, one that could explode with consequences. None of them were prepared, for a loud bang echoed through the hall, followed by shouting. The station trembled as if a force was trying to break in. The senior officer barked orders to his men. "Lock every door. Nobody gets in without my command." Inside the interrogation room, the tension grew unbearable. Sundar remained calm, his breathing steady, but inside he knew this was only the beginning. The promise he had made years ago was colliding with forces too powerful to ignore. The plainclothes man leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Sundar could hear. "Listen to me. If what you say is true, then you're not safe here. They'll come for you and they won't stop. Whatever is in that bag, it's more dangerous than any weapon." Sundar met his gaze. "The truth is always dangerous to those who fear it." Just then, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, the only sound the pounding rain and distant shouting outside. A flashlight beam cut through, the black shaking slightly in the hand of the younger officer, and then came the sound. Glass shattering, boots storming in, voices commanding everyone to stand down. Chaos erupted in the station. The door to the interrogation room shook violently as fists pounded against it. The senior officer shouted to hold it, but the hinges groaned under the pressure. Sundar sat still, his eyes closed, whispering to himself, "Mother, I kept my promise, but tonight, everything will change." The door finally cracked, splintering under the weight of the attack. The bag on the table seemed to glow faintly under the flickering flashlight, as if daring the world to reveal its secrets. And in that moment, as the door burst open and shadows flooded in, Sundar realized this was no longer just about him or the past. It was about what would come next, about who would have the courage to stand for the truth no matter the cost. The air inside the station was thick with panic. Shadows moved like predators through the narrow hallways, their boots striking the ground with precision. These were not ordinary men. Their movements carried discipline like soldiers who had trained for moments exactly like this. Every crash of broken glass, every shouted order echoed through the building like a drum of war. Inside the interrogation room, the officers braced against the door, their shoulders pressed hard, sweat dripping down their faces as they tried to hold it closed. The senior officer shouted at his men, his voice raw with urgency, but even he knew they couldn't hold it for long. The wood groaned under the weight of the battering, each impact sending vibrations through the floor. The younger officer clutched his flashlight in one hand and his pistol in the other, his breath quick and uneven. He glanced nervously at Sundar, who sat still in the chair, the bag in front of him. Sundar's calmness in that storm was unsettling. He seemed less like a prisoner and more like a man who had already accepted something far greater than fear. The plainclothes investigator leaned close to Sundar, his voice trembling. "Do you understand what's happening? They're here for you. They're here for that bag. If they get their hands on it, we're all finished." Sundar lifted his eyes slowly, his voice soft, yet filled with steel. "That is why it cannot fall into Their hands. What lies inside doesn't belong to them, and it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the truth. If it's destroyed, generations will never know what really happened. His words carried weight, striking everyone in the room with a sense of responsibility they hadn't felt before. The bag was no longer just an object, it was a burden that demanded sacrifice. Suddenly, the door cracked open with a thunderous crash. Splinters flew across the room and a dark figure forced its way through. He was dressed in black, his face hidden behind a mask, his weapon gleaming under the flickering light. Behind him, more shadows gathered, ready to storm in. The senior officer fired a warning shot, the deafening sound echoing off the walls. The masked men didn't flinch. They moved forward, relentless, their silence more terrifying than any shouted command. The plainclothes man grabbed Sundar's arm. "We have to move you now," he hissed. But Sundar didn't stand immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the bag, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. In that brief second, memories returned again, clearer than ever. He saw himself as a boy holding his father's hand as they stood in front of a crowd gathered after the tragedy. He remembered the silence, the fear in people's eyes, the way officials brushed everything under the rug, pretending nothing had happened. He remembered the night his mother pressed something small into his hands, whispering, "Protect this, Sundar. One day the world will need it." And now here it was, protected for years, hidden from those who wanted it erased, sitting exposed on a table in a police station under siege. The men finally forced their way in, pushing the officers back. The room erupted in chaos, shouts, gunfire, fists colliding in desperate struggle. The younger officer tried to shield the bag, but one of the masked intruders shoved him aside with brutal force. Sundar stood now, his hands still cuffed, his posture straight. Even in the storm of violence, his presence commanded the room. One of the intruders lunged for the bag, but before his fingers could touch it, Sundar stepped forward, placing himself between the man and the table. "You cannot take it," Sundar said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise like thunder. The masked man hesitated, his weapon raised. For a moment, the entire room froze, as if even time itself wanted to hear what would happen next. Sundar's eyes burned with quiet defiance. He wasn't holding a gun. He wasn't fighting back with violence, but there was something in his presence that made the intruder falter. And then, without warning, the lights went completely out. Pitch black swallowed the room. Only the storm outside gave flashes of light through the windows, illuminating fragments of chaos. A gun raised, a fist swung, a chair knocked over. In that confusion, someone grabbed Sundar's arm, dragging him toward the side door. His heart raced, unsure whether it was friend or foe. But as lightning lit up the room for a split second, he saw the face. It was the younger officer, his jaw clenched with determination. "Come with me, sir," the young man whispered fiercely. "If you stay here, they'll kill you. They'll take everything." Sundar glanced back toward the bag. It was still on the table, but half a dozen hands were reaching for it in the dark. He had a split second to decide. Go with the officer and save himself, or stay and protect the bag that held the truth of his family's promise. Sundar's chest tightened, his mind pulling between survival and sacrifice. The storm roared louder, the walls shaking as if the world itself demanded his choice. He turned, locking eyes with the officer, and whispered words that carried the weight of decades. "I cannot leave it. Not again." The young officer's eyes widened, torn between fear and loyalty. And in that exact moment, a deafening explosion rocked the station. Windows shattered, flames burst through the hallway, and the entire building seemed to collapse under the force. Sundar was thrown to the ground, the heat searing against his skin, the world spinning in fire and smoke. When the dust settled for a brief moment, the bag was no longer on the table. It was gone. And so was Sundar. The world returned in fragments, blinding flashes of light, the acrid sting of smoke in the air, the sound of groaning metal and crumbling walls. Sundar opened his eyes slowly, pain searing through his body as he realized he was lying on the cold floor, half covered in debris. The explosion had torn through the police station like a monster, leaving destruction in its path. For a moment, there was only ringing in his ears, a high-pitched hum that drowned out everything else. His chest rose and fell unevenly, every breath heavy with dust. He tried to push himself up, his wrists still bound, his body trembling with weakness, but his spirit was unbroken. When his vision cleared, he looked around. The room he had been in was unrecognizable. Walls cracked open, wires sparking from the ceiling, smoke curling in thick clouds. But the table where the bag had sat was empty. Sundar's heart sank. The bag, the one thing he had promised to protect, was gone. His eyes scanned the wreckage desperately. Among the chaos, he saw officers lying unconscious, some struggling to rise, others completely still. The younger officer, the one who had tried to help him escape, was on the ground not far from him. His uniform was torn, blood streaking across his face, but he was alive. He met Sundar's gaze with weary eyes and whispered hoarsely, They took it." Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to ask who they were. The masked intruders had succeeded in their mission. The truth he had carried for years, the truth his mother had begged him to protect, was now in the hands of those who would do anything to erase it. With a surge of strength, Sundar crawled over to the young officer, ignoring the pain that shot through his ribs. "Listen to me," Sundar said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You have to get up. You cannot give up now." The officer coughed, shaking his head. "Sir, we can't stop them. They're too powerful. If they wanted it, it's already gone." Sundar gripped his shoulder tightly, his eyes burning with determination. Power is not measured by weapons or force. It's measured by resilience. If they have it now, then we will take it back. Do you understand me? The truth doesn't belong to them. The officer's lips trembled, but something in Sundar's voice lit a spark in him. He nodded faintly. Before they could say more, heavy footsteps echoed in the distance. Voices barked orders, moving closer. Sundar pulled the officer into the shadows of the collapsed wall, hiding them both as the masked men marched past. Through the smoke, Sundar saw one of them clutching the bag tightly against his chest as if it were a treasure. Sundar's pulse quickened. Every instinct in him screamed to charge forward, to wrestle it back with his own hands. But he knew the moment wasn't right. He was unarmed, still cuffed, and weakened from the blast. To fight now would mean losing everything, including his life. Instead, he watched silently as the men disappeared into the storm outside, their vehicles waiting, with engines growling like predators. When the sound of the engines finally faded, Sundar allowed himself a long breath. The station was left in ruins, the officers stunned, and the truth once again slipping further from reach. The younger officer turned to him, his eyes wide with fear. "Sir, what was in that bag? Why would they risk so much to take it?" Sundar closed his eyes, his voice heavy with memory. Inside was not money, not jewels, not power in the way people imagine it. It was something older, something that holds the story of a forgotten injustice. Decades ago, an entire community was silenced. There were lives lost, names erased, truths buried. But one piece of evidence survived, just one. And that is what I carry, because without it, the world believes the lie. The officer swallowed, hard, his hands trembling. "But why you? Why would you carry it all these years?" Sundar's eyes softened, his voice breaking as he remembered the face of his mother. "Because I promised her. Because she was there when it happened. She saw it all, but no one believed her. They called her a liar, they called her mad. But she was neither. She was brave. She pressed that evidence into my hands and told me, 'Never let them bury it again.' And I swore to her I never would." Tears stung his eyes, but Sundar blinked them back, his jaw tightening. The young officer stared at him, stunned by the weight of his words. "Then we have to get it back," he said firmly, surprising even himself with the courage in his voice. "We can't let them erase it again. Tell me what to do and I'll stand with you." Sundar placed a hand on his shoulder, gratitude flickering in his tired eyes. "Then we will move together. But you must know, this will not be easy. The ones who took it, they are not just thieves. They are part of something bigger, something that has worked for years to bury the past. They won't stop. They will hunt us, silence us, destroy us if they can. Are you ready for that? The officer hesitated, his fear clear, but then he nodded slowly. If the truth is as important as you say, then I'd rather fight for it than live in a world built on lies. Before Sundar could reply, the plainclothes investigator staggered into the ruined room, his face bloodied but his eyes alert. They're heading east, he rasped. I saw their vehicles, they're not gone yet. Sundar's heart quickened. This was his chance. Then we follow, Sundar said firmly. The investigator shook his head. You don't understand. They're not just escaping. They're going to destroy it. They have a place where they burn everything they can't control. If they reach there, it's over. The truth will vanish forever. A heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of distant sirens. Sundar clenched his fists, the weight of his promise pressing down harder than ever. Then we cannot let them reach it, Sundar said, his voice low but unshakable. The younger officer leaned in, whispering urgently. But how do we stop them? We have no weapons, no backup, no time. They're stronger, faster, better prepared. Sundar's eyes blazed with quiet fire. We have something they don't, he said. The officer frowned. What's that? Sundar held his gaze, his voice steady as steel. We have the truth, and men who fight for truth cannot be broken. The storm outside roared louder, the night alive with danger. The ruins of the station stood as a reminder of how powerful the enemy was. Yet in that moment, in the ashes of defeat, a small fire of resistance began to burn. Sundar rose to his feet, still cuffed, his body aching but his resolve stronger than ever. The road ahead was unclear, filled with peril, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not stop until the truth was safe again. And as he stepped into the rain-soaked night, lightning tearing the sky open above him, a single question haunted the air like a whisper. Who really wanted the truth buried? And why? The rain was relentless, sheets of water hammering against the broken streets as Sundar stepped into the night. The young officer stayed close behind him, and the plainclothes investigator, though limping, refused to fall back. Every part of Sundar's body ached, but the fire in his heart was stronger than any pain. The bag was gone, taken by men who would stop at nothing to destroy it. But Sundar knew that his promise to his mother left no room for surrender. The three of them moved, quickly, following the trail of black vehicles that had left the station in ruins. The roads shimmered under the glow of passing streetlights, but the city felt darker than ever. Each corner they turned carried the possibility of ambush, each shadow a threat. Still, Sundar pressed forward, his face calm, his thoughts anchored in one memory, the day his mother handed him the evidence. He remembered her eyes, tired yet fierce, and her voice trembling but unshakable. The truth is not for us, Sundar. It is for those who come after us. You must keep it alive. After nearly an hour of pursuit, they reached the outskirts of the city. Ahead, hidden beyond tall steel fences, smoke rose faintly into the storm. The investigator's voice was low, urgent. That's their site. I've heard rumors about it. They call it the furnace. Everything they want erased, documents, recordings, objects, they bring it here. Nothing ever leaves. Sundar's chest tightened. If the bag reached that furnace, decades of history would vanish forever. The younger officer's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on his weapon. Sir, there are at least 20 of them in there, maybe more. They'll kill us the second we step inside. Sundar turned to him, his expression steady. Fear is natural, but courage is choosing to act even while afraid. Tonight we cannot walk away. Not for ourselves, but for those who were silenced. The words struck deep, pulling strength into the young man's heart. They crept closer, moving through the shadows, until they reached a vantage point overlooking the compound. Through the pouring rain, they saw the masked men unloading crates in the bag being carried toward the glowing mouth of the furnace. Sundar's breath caught. The faint outline of the item inside could be seen against the light. It was small, fragile, yet carried the weight of countless lives. "We have to move now," the investigator whispered. And they did. What followed was chaos and desperation. The three of them burst from the shadows, the storm at their backs. The young officer fired warning shots, scattering the men, while Sundar, still cuffed, charged forward with a force born not of violence, but of unyielding resolve. Fists collided, shouts echoed, bodies clashed in the rain. Sundar moved through the chaos like a man possessed. Every strike against him, every shove to the ground, was answered by the memory of his mother, the faces of the forgotten, the weight of truth that demanded to be freed. He reached the furnace just as one of the masked men lifted the bag high, ready to throw it into the flames. "Stop!" Sundar's voice thundered across the compound, cutting through the storm. The man hesitated, shocked by the raw power in his voice. Sundar stumbled forward, his body bruised and bloodied, his wrists bleeding from the cuffs, but his eyes were aflame with something untouchable. "Do you know what you are about to destroy?" Sundar demanded. "Do you know how many voices will be lost forever because of your fear? These are not just objects in this bag. They are lives. They are truths. They are promises that deserve to be heard." The man faltered, but another barked, an order, shouting for him to throw it in. Sundar fell to his knees, rain soaking him to the bone, his voice breaking but fierce. "If you burn it, you burn my mother's soul. You burn the hope of every child who believes lies cannot last forever. If you destroy it, you destroy your own humanity." For a heartbeat, the entire compound went silent. The storm roared around them, but within the circle of men there was only the sound of Sundar's words. The masked man holding the bag trembled. His grip loosened. In that hesitation, the young officer lunged forward, knocking the bag from his hands. It fell to the ground, the leather darkened by the rain but safe from the fire. The fight reignited, but something had shifted. Some of the men hesitated now, their conviction shaken by Sundar's words. Others continued to attack, desperate to finish what they had started. In the chaos, Sundar crawled to the bag and pulled it close to his chest. With trembling fingers, he finally opened it wide, letting the rain touch what had been hidden for so long. Inside was a stack of yellowed papers, photographs blurred by time, and a small cassette tape, evidence of a massacre decades old, committed by powerful figures who had silenced an entire community and buried their suffering. The papers carried names, the photographs showed faces, and the tape carried voices that had once cried for justice. As Sundar held it high for all to see, he shouted through the storm, his voice echoing with unshakable strength. "This is what you fear. Not me. Not my name. Not my power. You fear the truth, because the truth does not die. No matter how hard you try to bury it, it will rise again." His words were like lightning, striking deep into every soul present. Some of the masked men dropped their weapons, shame flooding their faces. Others fled into the night, unwilling to face what they had tried to destroy. The young officer and the investigator stood by Sundar, battered but unbroken, watching as the storm slowly began to calm. Sundar clutched the bag tightly, tears mingling with the rain on his face. His mother's promise was alive. The truth had survived the fire. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "I kept it, Amma. I kept it safe." And in that moment, with the storm clearing and the evidence still intact, Sundar knew that his burden was not just his own anymore. It belonged to the world, and the world would finally hear the voices that had been silenced for too long. The furnace still glowed in the distance, but it had failed to consume the truth. Sundar had carried it through fire, through betrayal, through fear, and now it stood in the open, untouchable, as dawn broke slowly over the horizon, painting the wet earth with pale light. Sundar rose to his feet, weak but resolute. The fight was far from over. The powerful would resist. The liars would strike back. But the first step had been taken. The truth was no longer buried. And with that, Sundar walked into the light of a new day, the bag pressed firmly against his heart, ready to face whatever battles lay ahead.